My name is Dr. Vincent Maddox. I'm an NSA cryptanalyst who survived the first 7 days of the zombie outbreak that destroyed civilization. While my colleagues transformed into flesh-hungry monsters around me, I discovered the horrifying truth. This wasn't an accident. Someone orchestrated this apocalypse, and I have the evidence to prove it. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dr. Vincent Samuel Maddox, and for the past 8 years, I worked as a senior cryptanalyst for the National Security Agency at our facility in Fort Meade, Maryland. I held top-secret clearance with sensitive compartmented information access, which means I spent my days deep inside one of the most secure buildings in America, analyzing encrypted communications from hostile nations and terrorist organizations. I decoded their secrets, predicted their moves, and helped keep this country safe from threats most people never even knew existed. But nothing in my training, nothing in my experience analyzing global threats, prepared me for what happened 7 days ago. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a survivor's account of the zombie outbreak that destroyed civilization as we know it. This is a warning, and more importantly, this is the truth about what really happened and who was responsible. I need you to understand something from the start. I wasn't supposed to survive this. The people who orchestrated this apocalypse had calculated every variable, planned for every contingency, except for one small detail that saved my life and gave me access to information that could change everything. They didn't account for the fact that I was wearing military-grade, noise-canceling headphones in a soundproof analysis booth when they triggered the signal that turned 90% of humanity into mindless, flesh-hungry monsters. Let me take you back to that Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 week ago. I arrived at Crypto City at my usual time, 6:30 in the morning, and immediately noticed something unusual in the overnight intelligence reports. Our automated monitoring systems had detected coordinated signal activity across multiple global communication networks. Nothing threatening on the surface, just transmission sources going active simultaneously in patterns that didn't match any known operational protocols. As a cryptanalyst, you develop an instinct for when something doesn't fit. Random events don't happen in perfect synchronization across different continents, different time zones, different technological infrastructure. But that's exactly what our systems were recording. Cellular towers in major cities, satellite uplinks, radio broadcasting stations, even military communication arrays, all showing increased activity that started at precisely the same moment, adjusted for time zones. I spent the morning trying to decode what these signals meant. The transmissions themselves were encrypted using methods I'd never seen before, but the coordination was what bothered me most. In my 8 years at the NSA, I'd analyzed communication patterns from every major intelligence agency, terrorist organization, and rogue state on the planet. This level of simultaneous coordination across global infrastructure required resources and access that only a handful of entities possessed. The more I analyzed the data, the more convinced I became that this wasn't foreign intelligence or terrorist activity. The signal sources were too well distributed, too perfectly positioned within our own communication networks. Someone with intimate knowledge of American infrastructure was orchestrating this, and they had access to systems that should have been impossible to compromise. By lunchtime, I had identified over 300 transmission points across 6 continents, all synchronized to activate within a 60-second window. I submitted my preliminary analysis to my supervisor, recommending immediate investigation of potential domestic security threats. The response I received was to continue monitoring and report any new developments. Looking back now, I realize that response should have been a red flag. Any analyst discovering evidence of coordinated infiltration of global communication networks should have triggered immediate alerts to the highest levels of government. Instead, I was told to keep watching and wait for further instructions. I spent the afternoon in my usual workspace, a soundproof analysis booth designed to prevent electromagnetic interference and protect classified information from surveillance. The booth was equipped with specialized equipment that required me to wear noise-canceling headphones to filter out the ambient electronic noise from our monitoring systems. It was standard protocol for anyone working with sensitive signals intelligence. At 3:47 that afternoon, Eastern Standard Time, every piece of communication equipment on the planet began broadcasting the same signal simultaneously. I didn't hear it. I was completely isolated from the transmission by the soundproof booth and my protective equipment, but I could see its effects through the reinforced glass window that separated my workspace from the main analysis floor. The first thing I noticed was how quickly it happened. One moment, my colleagues were working normally at their stations, and the next, they were all clutching their heads in obvious agony. Within seconds, everyone on the main floor was screaming, convulsing, foam pouring from their mouths as they collapsed to the ground. I immediately removed my headphones and tried to communicate with them through the booth's intercom system, but the screaming had already stopped. They were all lying motionless on the floor, and for a brief moment, I thought they were dead. Then I saw their eyes. Every single person on that floor had the same thing happen to their eyes. The color was completely gone, replaced by solid black, as if someone had poured ink directly into their skulls. Their skin had turned a sickly gray color, and when they started to move again, it wasn't human movement anymore. They got up slowly, awkwardly, like they were learning how to use their bodies for the first time. But once they were standing, they moved with a single-minded purpose that was terrifying to watch. They were hungry, and they were looking for food. The first attack happened within minutes. Sarah Martinez, who had been analyzing Russian communications at the station next to mine, grabbed Tom Wilson from the cybersecurity team and bit into his neck with a violence that splattered blood across 3 workstations. Tom's screams lasted exactly 15 seconds before he went silent, and within 2 minutes, he was standing up with the same black eyes and gray skin. I realized immediately that whatever had happened to them was transmitted through the signal they had heard. The timing was too perfect, the simultaneous collapse too coordinated to be coincidence. Someone had weaponized our own communication networks against us, and I was watching the results through bulletproof glass. The facility's emergency protocols activated automatically. Blast doors sealed every section of the building, backup power. Systems engaged, and the complex went into complete lockdown mode. Emergency lighting cast everything in red shadows, and the automated voice system began announcing containment procedures over the intercom. But the infected didn't respond to the announcements like confused or frightened people would. They responded like predators hearing the dinner bell. Every emergency alarm, every automated voice command, every electronic beep and chime drew them. Like magnets, they moved as a group toward any source of sound, and their response was immediate and coordinated. I watched through the security camera feeds as similar scenes played out throughout the entire facility. Every floor, every section, every office space had the same result. Anyone who had heard the signal was now infected, and anyone who hadn't heard it was either dead or hiding. Using the booth's internal communication system, I managed to contact other survivors throughout the building. There were 17 of us total, scattered across different sections, all protected by the same factors that had saved me. Some had been wearing hearing protection, others had been in soundproof rooms, and a few had been in areas where the signal transmission was blocked by specialized shielding. Dr. Jennifer Chun from the linguistics department had been in the anechoic chamber testing audio equipment. Marcus Thompson from building maintenance had been wearing industrial hearing protection while working on the Vega system. Lieutenant Sarah Burke from our military liaison office had been in the SEAF reviewing classified documents with noise-canceling equipment. Each of us had a different story, but the same result. We had been protected from the signal, and we were still human. Over the next few hours, we established a communication network using the facility's hardened internal systems. We had access to food storage, water supplies, backup power, and most importantly, we had access to the NSA's global monitoring network. We could see what was happening to the rest of the world. The scope of the disaster was beyond anything I could have imagined. Every major city on every continent was going dark. Military bases, government facilities, civilian population centers, all falling silent within hours of the initial transmission. The few radio communications that were still broadcasting painted the same picture everywhere: mass casualties, complete breakdown of social order, and infected attacking anyone who made noise. But there were other signals too, transmissions, that didn't match any standard emergency protocols. Automated broadcasts on frequencies that should have been secure, coded communications that didn't correspond to any known government or military systems. Someone was still out there, still transmitting, still coordinating something. I spent that first night analyzing these mysterious signals while my fellow survivors secured our section of the facility and took inventory of our resources. We had enough food and water for several weeks, access to medical supplies, and comprehensive security systems that were still operational. We also had something invaluable: real-time intelligence about what was happening globally. The infected, we learned through careful observation, were attracted to sound. Any noise louder than a whisper would draw them from significant distances, and they would converge on the source with devastating efficiency. The emergency broadcasts that were still active were actually making the situation worse, drawing infected toward survivor groups who were trying to coordinate rescue efforts. But the most disturbing discovery came from analyzing the infected's behavior patterns through our security cameras. They weren't moving randomly or acting on pure instinct. There was organization to their movements, coordination that suggested they were responding to external control signals. They moved in groups, covered territory systematically, and seemed to be following directives that came from somewhere else. I cross-referenced the timing of their coordinated movements with the mysterious automated broadcasts I had detected, and found a correlation that chilled me to the bone. Every time one of these unknown signals transmitted, the infected would change their behavior patterns within minutes. Someone was still controlling them, directing their actions through the same communication networks that had created them in the first place. During those first 24 hours, I also discovered something else that would prove crucial to understanding what had really happened. Deep in the classified database systems that I had access to, I found references to something called Project Silent Storm. The files were heavily redacted, but what I could read described a theoretical weapon designed to disable enemy communication networks during wartime. The project had been developed by a joint task force of intelligence agencies, military contractors, and civilian technology companies. The basic concept was to use coordinated electromagnetic pulses transmitted through existing communication infrastructure to overload and destroy enemy equipment. But the files I was reading suggested that the project had evolved beyond simple equipment destruction. The later documents, dated just 6 months ago, referenced biological effects of specific electromagnetic frequencies on human neural activity. There were mentions of behavioral modification, cognitive disruption, and something called neural override protocols. The files were classified at levels above my clearance, but the emergency access protocols activated by the facility lockdown had given me temporary access to information I normally wouldn't have been able to read. What I found in those files suggested that Project Silent Storm hadn't been theoretical at all. It had been operational, and someone had just used it to destroy civilization. The second day brought new challenges and new discoveries. The infected had found ways to bypass some of our security measures, and we had to constantly adapt our survival strategies. But more importantly, I was starting to piece together evidence that this wasn't just an attack by foreign enemies or terrorist organizations. The coordination of the signal transmission, the intimate knowledge of our communication infrastructure, the access to classified frequency bands, all pointed to domestic involvement. Someone within our own government or intelligence community had either orchestrated this attack or had been compromised by those who did. I spent hours analyzing the communication patterns, cross-referencing signal sources with known government and military installations, and building a picture of who might have had the capability to execute such a coordinated assault. The results were terrifying. The signal hadn't just been broadcast from foreign sources or captured enemy equipment. It had originated from dozens of legitimate American communication facilities, including military bases, government installations, and civilian infrastructure that should have been under strict security protocols. Someone had used our own systems against us, and they had done it with precision that suggested inside knowledge and access. As the second day progressed, tensions began to rise among our group of survivors. Some wanted to attempt contact with the outside world, hoping to coordinate with other survivor groups or government rescue operations. Others, including myself, argued that any transmission would only draw the infected to our location and potentially compromise our security. The debate was complicated by the fact that I had access to classified information that could help other survivors, but sharing that information would violate security protocols and potentially put more people at risk. I knew the locations of other government facilities that might still be operational, emergency supply caches that could help survivor groups, and communication frequencies that might still be secure. But I also knew that the people responsible for this attack were still out there, still monitoring communications, still coordinating the infected through signals that I could detect but not yet decode. Any transmission from our location could be traced back to us, and the consequences would be fatal for everyone in our group. The conflict came to a head when Dr. Chen discovered that our facility's emergency beacon was still active, broadcasting our location and status to any rescue operations that might be monitoring standard emergency frequencies. She wanted to increase the signal strength and add additional information about our survivor count and available resources. I tried to explain why this was dangerous, but without revealing the classified information I had access to. My arguments sounded like paranoia. The other survivors saw someone who was withholding potentially life-saving information, and they were starting to question whether my analysis of the situation was accurate or just the result of professional paranoia. The truth was, I was becoming more paranoid by the hour, but it was justified paranoia, based on intelligence that painted a picture of betrayal and conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The people responsible for this attack had access to information that should have been available only to a handful of individuals with the highest security clearances. They knew which facilities would be vulnerable, which communication networks could be compromised, which emergency protocols would be activated, and how to coordinate the infected to maximize casualties and minimize the chances of organized resistance. This wasn't just a terrorist attack or foreign invasion. This was a coordinated assault by people who understood our systems intimately because they had helped build them. But what I discovered over the next 2 days changed everything I thought I knew about this outbreak and revealed a conspiracy that went far deeper than I had initially suspected. By the morning of day 2, I had established a systematic approach to monitoring global communications using the NSA as surviving equipment. The scale of what I was witnessing through our intelligence networks was staggering. Every major population center across 6 continents had gone silent within the first 18 hours. New York, London, Tokyo, Moscow, Beijing, Sydney, all the great cities of the world had stopped transmitting normal civilian and government communications. But they weren't completely silent. There were still signals, just not the kind you would expect from coordinated rescue operations or emergency government responses. Instead, I was intercepting fragmented distress calls, automated emergency broadcasts that repeated endlessly with no one left alive to respond to them. And most disturbing of all, those mysterious coded transmissions that seemed to be coordinating something across the infected zones. I spent the early morning hours analyzing the final communications from various government agencies around the world. The pattern was always the same. Normal operations until exactly 3:47 Eastern Time, then sudden chaos, screaming, and silence. The European Union's Emergency Coordination Center in Brussels transmitted for exactly 12 minutes after the initial signal before going dark. The Pentagon's emergency communications lasted only 8 minutes. NORAD managed 18 minutes before their final transmission cut off mid-sentence. What struck me most about these final communications was how quickly military and government personnel had succumbed. These were facilities with the highest security protocols, the most advanced protective equipment, and personnel trained to handle crisis situations. Yet they had fallen just as quickly as civilian populations. The signal had bypassed every defensive measure we had in place. I cross-referenced the timing of facility shutdowns with their locations and found something that chilled me to the bone. The facilities that went silent first weren't necessarily the ones closest to major population centers or communication hubs. They were the ones with the most advanced communication equipment, the highest level security clearances, and the most sophisticated electronic infrastructure. Someone had specifically targeted our most secure installations first. The 17 other survivors in our facility represented a cross-section of NSA personnel, each with different specialties and access levels. Dr. Jennifer Chun from linguistics had been working on voice pattern analysis for foreign intelligence targets. Marcus Thompson from maintenance had 20 years of experience with the facility's security systems and knew every tunnel, vent, and access point in the complex. Lieutenant Sarah Burke had been our liaison with military intelligence and had access to joint operations databases. Each person brought unique knowledge to our survival situation, but they also brought different perspectives on what we should do next. The debate about whether to attempt outside contact was intensifying, and I found myself in the uncomfortable position of arguing against actions that seemed logical to people who didn't have access to the classified information I was analyzing. Dr. Chun had discovered that our facility's communication array was still fully operational and could potentially reach other government installations across the country. She had identified what appeared to be automated distress signals from facilities in Colorado, Texas, and Nevada that suggested other survivor groups might be trying to coordinate rescue operations. Her argument was compelling. We had the capability to help other survivors and possibly establish contact with functioning government units. Marcus Thompson supported her position from a practical standpoint. Our food and water supplies, while substantial, weren't infinite. The facility's backup power systems were designed for short-term emergency operations, not indefinite occupation. He calculated that we had perhaps 3 weeks of sustainable resources before we would need to either resupply or relocate. Establishing contact with other groups could provide information about supply caches or safer locations. Lieutenant Burke approached the situation from a military perspective. She argued that coordination with other survivor groups was essential for any hope of organized resistance against whatever force had orchestrated this attack. If there were still functioning military units, we had an obligation to make contact and contribute our intelligence capabilities to any coordinated response. Their arguments made sense from every logical standpoint except one. They didn't know what I knew about who was responsible for this attack and what capabilities they still possessed. I was analyzing intelligence that suggested the perpetrators were still active, still monitoring communications, and still coordinating the infected through signals that I could detect, but hadn't yet been able to decode. Throughout the second day, I continued intercepting those mysterious coded transmissions on frequencies that should have been secure. The signals were using encryption methods that were unfamiliar to me, but the transmission pattern suggested they were coordinating activities across multiple infected zones. Every few hours, a new coded signal would broadcast, and within minutes, I could observe changes in infected behavior patterns through our security cameras. The infected in our immediate area had initially been attracted to the facility by the emergency alarms and automated systems that had activated during the lockdown. But their behavior was becoming more systematic. Instead of random wandering or simple response to immediate stimuli, they were beginning to patrol the area in organized groups, covering territory in patterns that suggested they were searching for something specific. This coordinated behavior was impossible to explain through normal zombie outbreak scenarios. The infected weren't just mindless creatures driven by hunger or instinct. They were receiving and responding to instructions, and those instructions were coming from the same communication networks that had created them in the first place. I spent hours analyzing the correlation between the coded transmissions and infected behavior changes. The pattern was consistent: coded signal broadcasts, followed within 30 to 60 minutes by observable changes in how the infected moved, where they concentrated their attention, and how they coordinated their activities. Someone was still controlling them, directing their actions from a remote location. This discovery had profound implications for any survivor group trying to establish communications or coordinate rescue operations. Every transmission, every attempt to reach out to other survivors, could potentially be monitored and used to direct infected attacks against those locations. The very act of trying to organize resistance might be providing the enemy with targeting information. But I couldn't explain this to my fellow survivors without revealing classified information about signals, intelligence capabilities, and methods. The techniques I was using to analyze these transmissions were classified at levels that would require security clearances these people didn't possess. Even in our current situation, with civilization collapsed around us, I was bound by oaths and protocols that prevented me from sharing certain types of information. The conflict between operational security and group survival was tearing me apart. I had information that could save lives, but sharing it could compromise intelligence, methods that might be crucial if any part of our government survived this catastrophe. I was trained to protect sources and methods even at the cost of individual operations, but this wasn't just an individual operation anymore. This was potentially the survival of human civilization. On the afternoon of Day 2, Lieutenant Burke made a discovery that added another layer of complexity to our situation. While reviewing the Joint Operations database she had access to, she found references to emergency evacuation protocols that had been activated at multiple government facilities. In the hours before the attack, the protocols weren't standard emergency procedures, but specific evacuation orders that had moved key personnel to undisclosed locations. The timing of these evacuations was suspicious. They had begun approximately 6 hours before the signal transmission, suggesting that someone with advanced knowledge of the attack had arranged for certain people to be in safe locations when it occurred. This wasn't just evidence of inside knowledge. It was evidence of conspiracy at the highest levels of government. Burke shared this information with the group, and it changed the entire dynamic of our discussions about outside contact. If government personnel had been evacuated in advance, it meant there were people who knew this attack was coming and had prepared for it. But it also raised the question of whether those people were victims of the conspiracy or participants in it. I realized that Lieutenant Burke's discovery corroborated intelligence I had been analyzing independently. The facilities that had gone silent first weren't just the ones with the most advanced communication equipment. They were also the ones where no advance evacuations had taken place. The facilities that had received evacuation orders were primarily ones with lower security classifications and less critical intelligence capabilities. Someone had selectively protected certain government personnel while leaving others, including most of the intelligence community, exposed to the attack. This suggested that the conspiracy involved people with intimate knowledge of government operations and the ability to influence emergency protocols across multiple agencies. As evening approached on day 2, I made the decision to share some of my analysis with the group, carefully avoiding the most sensitive details about sources and methods. I explained that I had been monitoring communications that suggested the attack was coordinated by domestic sources with access to classified information and government systems. I told them about the correlation between coded transmissions and infected behavior, and why any communication from our facility could potentially be used to direct attacks against us. The reaction was mixed. Dr. Chun accused me of being paranoid and withholding information that could help other survivors. Marcus Thompson was more supportive, acknowledging that his experience with facility security had shown him how easily systems could be compromised by people with inside knowledge. Lieutenant Burke was troubled by the implications of the evacuation data she had discovered and began to see the connections I was drawing. But the most significant development came from Sarah Martinez, one of the communications specialists who had survived by being in a shielded testing chamber when the signal hit. She had been quietly analyzing the same mysterious transmissions I had been monitoring, using different methods and different equipment. Her findings supported my conclusions, but revealed additional details that painted an even more disturbing picture. Martinez had identified the source locations for several of the coded transmissions. They weren't coming from foreign countries or unknown facilities. They were originating from legitimate United States government installations, including military bases, intelligence facilities, and civilian emergency management centers. The people controlling the infected weren't external enemies. They were using our own infrastructure to coordinate the destruction of our civilization. This revelation changed everything. We weren't just dealing with a terrorist attack or foreign invasion. We were dealing with a coordinated conspiracy that involved people within our own government and intelligence community. The attack had been planned and executed by individuals with access to our most secure systems and intimate knowledge of our vulnerabilities. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Someone had spent months or years preparing for this attack, positioning themselves to use our own communication networks against us, arranging for the protection of certain government personnel while leaving others exposed, and establishing systems to control the infected after the initial attack succeeded. But the most terrifying implication was that these people were still out there, still operational, still coordinating their activities through government systems that should have been secure. They had successfully destroyed civilization as we knew it, but they weren't finished. The coded transmissions suggested they were still executing some kind of ongoing operation, using the infected as a tool to achieve objectives that remained unclear. On the morning of day 3, our situation became more precarious. The infected around our facility had organized themselves into what could only be described as patrol groups. Instead of wandering randomly or simply responding to immediate stimuli, they were systematically covering the area around our building in coordinated sweeps. Their behavior suggested they were searching for something specific, and I had a growing suspicion that they were searching for us. The correlation between the coded transmissions and infected behavior was becoming more precise. I could now predict changes in their patrol patterns based on the timing and characteristics of the mysterious signals. This predictability was both useful for our security planning and terrifying in its implications. The level of control being exercised over the infected was far beyond anything that could be achieved through simple electromagnetic manipulation. Dr. Chen made another disturbing discovery while analyzing the facility's communication logs. Our emergency beacon, which had been broadcasting our location and status since the lockdown began, was transmitting on frequencies that overlapped with some of the coded signals I had been monitoring. There was a possibility that our own distress signal was being used to coordinate infected activities in our area. This discovery sparked another heated debate about whether to shut down the beacon. Dr. Chun argued that it was our only hope of being found by rescue operations. Lieutenant Burke supported maintaining the signal because it was standard protocol for isolated military units. But Marcus Thompson and I argued that the beacon might be drawing the infected to our location and providing our enemies with information about our capabilities and resources. The debate was complicated by the fact that shutting down the beacon would require accessing communication equipment in sections of the facility that were now occupied by infected personnel. The risk of exposure would be significant, and there was no guarantee that we could safely complete the shutdown without attracting attention from the infected patrols outside. While we debated our options, I continued analyzing the coded transmissions and building a more complete picture of the conspiracy we were facing. The signals were originating from at least 12 different government facilities across the country, suggesting a coordinated network of conspirators with access to secure communication systems. The timing and content of the transmissions indicated they were following a predetermined plan with specific phases and objectives. Phase 1 had been the initial attack that created the infected and destroyed most of civilization. Phase 2 appeared to be ongoing, involving the systematic elimination of survivor groups and the consolidation of control over infected populations. But there were references in the coded transmissions to a Phase 3 that hadn't yet been implemented. And the implications of what that might involve were keeping me awake at night. I also discovered evidence that the conspiracy extended beyond just government and intelligence personnel. Some of the coded transmissions were coordinating with private sector entities, including technology companies, defense contractors, and civilian infrastructure operators. The scope of the coordination suggested years of planning and infiltration across multiple sectors of society. The most disturbing aspect of this discovery was the realization that the people responsible for this attack had intimate knowledge of not just our vulnerabilities, but also our response capabilities. They knew which facilities would survive the initial attack, which personnel would be in positions to organize resistance, and which communication networks would remain operational. They had planned for every contingency except the one that had saved my life: the random chance that some people would be protected by soundproof equipment or noise-canceling technology. As day 3 progressed, the tension within our group continued to escalate. The knowledge that we were facing a domestic conspiracy rather than a foreign attack changed everyone's perspective on our situation. We couldn't trust normal government protocols or assume that official rescue operations would be legitimate. We were on our own in a way that none of us had prepared for. But the most significant development came late in the afternoon when I intercepted a coded transmission that included specific references to our facility. The signal contained coordinate data that matched our location and tactical information that suggested the senders knew details about our building's layout, security systems, and current occupancy. We weren't just hiding from mindless infected creatures. We were being actively hunted by people who knew exactly where we were and what resources we had available. This discovery forced me to make a decision that would determine whether we lived or died. I had to choose between maintaining operational security and sharing information that could save our lives, even if it compromised intelligence methods and sources that might be crucial for any surviving government operations. The choice was made for me when Marcus Thompson discovered that the infected patrol groups were beginning to focus their activities on the specific sections of the building where we were sheltering. Their behavior had shifted from random searching to targeted surveillance of our exact location. Someone was directing them to our position using information that could only have come from monitoring our communications or analyzing our electromagnetic signatures. We were no longer just survivors hiding from a zombie outbreak. We were targets in a coordinated hunt by people who had the resources, knowledge, and capability to track us down and eliminate us. The conspiracy we were facing had anticipated the possibility of survivors like us and had prepared methods to deal with us systematically. But by day 4, I realized we weren't just fighting zombies. We were fighting something much worse, and the terrible truth I uncovered would challenge everything we thought we knew about who we could trust and what was really happening to our world. Day 4 began with a crisis that shattered any illusions we still had about the nature of our situation. Tom Brennan, one of the security guards who had survived the initial attack, suffered what could only be described as a complete psychological breakdown. The stress of watching his colleagues transform into monsters, combined with 3 days of isolation and the growing realization that rescue wasn't coming, pushed him beyond his breaking point. It started just after dawn when Tom began talking to himself, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. Dr. Chun tried to calm him down, but his delusions were escalating rapidly. He became convinced that his wife and children were trapped somewhere in the building, calling out to him for help. No amount of reasoning could convince him that his family wasn't in the facility, that they were safe at home when this started, that the voices he was hearing weren't real. The situation became dangerous when Tom started shouting their names, demanding that we help him search for them. His voice echoed through the corridors, and within minutes, we could hear the infected responding. The mindless creatures that had been patrolling the area outside began converging on our location, drawn by Tom's increasingly frantic calls for his family. Marcus Thompson and Lieutenant Burke tried to physically restrain Tom, but he fought them with the strength of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. His screaming intensified, and through our security cameras, I watched as dozens of infected began surrounding the building. They weren't just wandering toward the sound. They were moving with purpose, coordinating their approach from multiple directions. The infected response to Tom's breakdown confirmed my worst fears about their behavior patterns. They weren't just attracted to sound in a general sense. They were responding to specific types of vocalizations with tactical precision. Their approach pattern suggested they were receiving real-time coordination from an external source, directing them to surround the building and cut off potential escape routes. We managed to get Tom sedated using medical supplies from the facility's emergency kit, but the damage was done. The infected had located our exact position and were now actively besieging the building. Through the security cameras, I could see them testing different entry points, probing for weaknesses in our defenses with an intelligence that contradicted everything we thought we knew about their capabilities. But more disturbing than their tactical behavior was what I observed when I analyzed the timing of their response. The infected had begun moving toward our location approximately 30 seconds before Tom started screaming. They had been directed to our position by one of those coded transmissions I had been monitoring, and Tom's breakdown had simply provided them with acoustic confirmation of our exact location. This meant that whoever was controlling the infected had been planning this assault regardless of Tom's psychological crisis. They knew where we were. They knew how many of us were in the building, and they were systematically eliminating survivor groups using coordinated attacks that appeared to be random responses to noise, but were actually carefully orchestrated operations. The realization that we were under deliberate attack rather than random siege changed everything about our survival strategy. We weren't just hiding from mindless creatures. We were engaged in active combat with an enemy that had intelligence capabilities, tactical coordination, and the ability to direct hundreds of infected as weapons against specific targets, while the others focused on reinforcing our defenses and preparing for a potential breach. I used the crisis as an opportunity to dive deeper into the classified databases that my emergency access privileges allowed me to explore. What I found in those files revealed a conspiracy so vast and terrifying that it challenged everything I thought I knew about the attack that had destroyed civilization. Project Silent Storm wasn't just a theoretical weapon system as I had initially believed. It was a fully operational program that had been under development for over 3 years, involving multiple government agencies, private defense contractors, and international intelligence partnerships. The project had been classified at the highest levels, with access restricted to fewer than 50 individuals across the entire government. The core concept of Project Silent Storm was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. Rather than using traditional weapons to destroy enemy forces, the system would use coordinated electromagnetic transmissions to override human neural activity, essentially turning enemy populations into controllable biological weapons that would destroy their own infrastructure and eliminate organized resistance. The initial research had focused on specific brainwave frequencies that could disrupt normal neural function, causing temporary disorientation and confusion in enemy troops. But the project had evolved far beyond those limited objectives. The later phases had developed methods to completely override human consciousness, replacing individual will with externally controlled behavioral patterns. The files I was reading described extensive human testing that had been conducted under the cover of medical research and psychiatric treatment programs. Subjects had been exposed to various electromagnetic frequencies while researchers monitored their behavioral responses and neural activity. The results had been promising enough to justify scaling up to full operational capability. But the most disturbing aspect of the Project Silent Storm files was the list of personnel who had been involved in its development. The names included senior officials from the NSA, CIA, Department of Defense, and several private contractors who specialized in advanced communication technologies. These weren't random conspirators or foreign agents. They were people at the highest levels of our own government and intelligence community. Cross-referencing the personnel list with the evacuation orders that Lieutenant Burke had discovered revealed a pattern that made my blood run cold. Every single person who had been involved in Project Silent Storm had been evacuated from vulnerable locations in the hours before the attack. They had known exactly what was coming and had positioned themselves to survive the initial assault while the rest of us were left exposed. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. These people had spent years developing a weapon system designed to destroy enemy populations, and then they had turned it against their own country. They had used classified resources, government funding, and taxpayer-supported research to create the means of destroying American civilization. But the files also revealed something even more terrifying. The attack that had destroyed civilization was only the first phase of a larger operation. The Project Silent Storm documentation included detailed plans for multiple phases of implementation, with specific objectives and timelines for each stage of the operation. Phase 1 had been the initial signal transmission that created the infected and eliminated organized resistance. Phase 2, which was currently underway, involved the systematic elimination of survivor groups and the consolidation of control over infected populations. But Phase 3 was designed to establish permanent control over the remaining human population using a combination of technological manipulation and psychological conditioning. The infected weren't just weapons for destroying civilization. They were tools for rebuilding it according to the specifications of whoever controlled the system. The people responsible for this attack weren't trying to destroy humanity. They were trying to reshape it into something they could control completely. As I read through the operational plans for Phase 3, I realized that the coded transmissions I had been monitoring weren't just coordinating infected attacks against survivor groups. They were also testing and refining the control systems that would eventually be used to manage the remaining human population. Every transmission was gathering data about the effectiveness of the control methods and identifying ways to improve them. The implications were terrifying. If Phase 3 succeeded, The survivors of this apocalypse wouldn't be free to rebuild civilization according to their own values and objectives. They would be subject to the same electromagnetic control systems that had created the infected, turned into a managed population that existed solely to serve the interests of their controllers. While I was uncovering this horrifying truth, situation in our facility was deteriorating rapidly. The infected siege had intensified throughout the day, with more creatures arriving from surrounding areas in response to what appeared to be coordinated summoning signals. Their behavior had evolved from simple attraction to sound into organized tactical operations designed to breach our defenses. Marcus Thompson reported that they were attempting to access the building through multiple entry points simultaneously, suggesting they had detailed knowledge of our facility's layout and vulnerabilities. The infected weren't just randomly testing doors and windows. They were focusing their efforts on the specific structural weaknesses that would allow them to reach our location most efficiently. Dr. Chun made an even more disturbing discovery. While monitoring the facility's communication systems, the infected assault was being coordinated through transmissions that were originating from inside our own building. Someone or something within the facility was communicating with the external control systems, providing real-time intelligence about our defenses and directing the infected attacks. The realization that we had been compromised from within sparked a new wave of paranoia and suspicion among our group. We began questioning whether one of our fellow survivors might be working with the conspirators, or whether the facility's communication systems had been infiltrated by external hackers. The trust that had held our group together began to fracture as everyone became a potential threat. But the truth was even more disturbing than any of us had imagined. The communication signals weren't coming from a human collaborator or external hackers. They were coming from automated systems that had been integrated into the facility's infrastructure years ago as part of Project Silent Storm's development. Our own building had been designed to serve as a testing ground for the control systems that were now being used against us. The NSA facility at Crypto City hadn't just been a target of the attack. It had been a laboratory for developing the weapons that made the attack possible. The soundproof booths, the electromagnetic shielding, the sophisticated communication arrays, all of it had been designed to support research into methods of controlling human behavior through electromagnetic manipulation. The irony was devastating. The same systems that had protected me from the initial attack were now being used to coordinate the infected assault against our position. The facility that had been my workplace for 8 years had been built specifically to develop the technology that would destroy civilization, and I had been working within the heart of the conspiracy without ever knowing it. As evening approached on day 4, I made the decision to share my discoveries with the rest of the group. The magnitude of what we were facing was too important to keep secret, even if it meant revealing classified information that I was sworn to protect. The oaths I had taken to preserve national security were meaningless when the nation itself had been betrayed by the people who were supposed to defend it. The reaction to my revelations was mixed and intense. Dr. Chun refused to believe that government officials could be responsible for such a massive betrayal, arguing that the attack must have been carried out by foreign agents using stolen technology. Lieutenant Burke was more receptive, acknowledging that the evacuation patterns she had discovered supported my analysis of inside involvement. Marcus Thompson was the most pragmatic in his response. He didn't care whether the conspiracy involved government officials or foreign agents. He just wanted to know what it meant for our survival. His analysis of the facility's systems confirmed that we were being monitored and tracked by automated systems that had been integrated into the building's infrastructure. But Sarah Martinez, the communications specialist who had been analyzing the coded transmissions independently, provided the most disturbing confirmation of my findings. She had been able to decrypt portions of the control signals and had discovered that they contained detailed intelligence about survivor groups across the country. The people controlling the infected had comprehensive information about who had survived the initial attack and where they were located. The encrypted data included specifics about our facility, our personnel, our resources, and our capabilities. The attackers knew exactly how many people were in our group, what equipment we had access to, and what our defensive capabilities were. They had been planning our elimination with the same precision they had used to coordinate the initial attack. But the most terrifying revelation came when Martinez showed me the decrypted references to Phase 3 operations. The control systems that were currently being used to coordinate infected attacks were also being tested for their effectiveness in controlling normal human behavior. The electromagnetic frequencies that had created the infected could be modified to produce more subtle effects in uninfected populations. Instead of creating mindless monsters, the modified frequencies could induce specific behavioral patterns in normal humans: compliance, passivity, reduced critical thinking, and enhanced susceptibility to suggestion. The people responsible for this attack weren't just trying to eliminate resistance. They were preparing to establish permanent control over the survivors through technological manipulation of human consciousness. The scope of the conspiracy was beyond anything I had imagined possible. These people had developed the capability to control human behavior on a mass scale. They had used it to destroy civilization, and they were now preparing to use it to create a new form of society where individual freedom and independent thought would be impossible. As night fell on day 4, our situation became desperate. The infected siege had intensified to the point where our defenses were beginning to fail. The automated systems that were coordinating their attacks had identified the specific vulnerabilities in our security measures and were directing increasingly sophisticated assault patterns against our position. But more importantly, I had discovered that the people responsible for this attack were monitoring our communications and planning to eliminate us as part of their systematic program to neutralize all potential resistance. We weren't just random survivors trying to stay alive. We were specific targets who possessed information and capabilities that threatened their long-term objectives. The knowledge I had gained about Project Silent Storm and the conspiracy behind the attack made me a priority target for elimination. The other survivors in our group were valuable to the conspirators only as test subjects for their control systems, or as threats to be neutralized. Either way, our time was running out. The truth I had uncovered would have stayed buried if my fellow survivors hadn't made the worst decision possible. A choice that would lead to the death of everyone I had spent the past 4 days trying to protect, and would leave me alone with evidence of the greatest conspiracy in human history. The morning of day 5 brought an escalation in tensions that had been building since my revelation about Project Silent Storm and the conspiracy behind the attack. The other survivors were struggling to process the implications of what I had told them, and the psychological pressure was beginning to fracture our group in dangerous ways. Dr. Chun had spent the night reviewing the classified documents I had shared with her, and her worldview was crumbling. For 8 years, she had worked for an organization she believed was protecting American interests, only to discover that it had been developing weapons to use against American citizens. The cognitive dissonance was destroying her ability to function rationally. Lieutenant Burke was approaching the situation from a military perspective, trying to develop tactical responses to our predicament. But every option she considered led to the same conclusion. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy with resources that made conventional resistance futile. Her training had prepared her for combat against foreign enemies, not for a war against her own government. Marcus Thompson was focused on the practical aspects of our situation. The facility's automated systems were continuing to provide intelligence to our enemies. The infected siege was intensifying, and our resources were being depleted at an unsustainable rate. His analysis suggested we had perhaps 48 hours before our defensive capabilities would be completely overwhelmed. Sarah Martinez was the most disturbed by what we had learned. Her expertise in communications had allowed her to understand the technical aspects of the control systems better than the rest of us, and she grasped the full implications of what Phase 3 would mean for human civilization. The technology that had created this apocalypse could be used to eliminate individual freedom permanently. But the person whose reaction concerned me most was Tom Brennan. His psychological breakdown the previous day had left him in a fragile mental state, and the knowledge that his own government was responsible for the death of his family was pushing him toward another crisis. He had become obsessed with the idea of revenge against the people who had orchestrated this attack. The debate about our next course of action had been ongoing since dawn, with various proposals being discussed and rejected. Dr. Chun wanted to attempt contact with international authorities, believing that foreign governments might be willing to help expose the conspiracy. Lieutenant Burke favored trying to reach other military installations that might still be operational. Marcus Thompson argued for focusing on immediate survival rather than broader resistance efforts. But the proposal that gained the most support was also the most dangerous. Sarah Martinez had identified what appeared to be a break in the coded transmissions that suggested a window of opportunity to send out a detailed distress signal. She believed we could transmit comprehensive information about the conspiracy to multiple recipient addresses before the automated systems could track and eliminate us. The logic behind her proposal was compelling. If we were going to die anyway, we might as well ensure that the truth about Project Silent Storm and the conspiracy reached other survivors who could continue the resistance. The information we possessed could prevent other survivor groups from being eliminated and might eventually lead to exposure of the people responsible for the attack. I tried to explain why this was exactly what our enemies wanted us to do. The apparent break in their transmissions wasn't a vulnerability we could exploit. It was a trap designed to encourage us to reveal our location and capabilities. The people controlling the infected had been monitoring our communications from the beginning, and they were sophisticated enough to create false opportunities that would trick us into exposing ourselves. My arguments were met with increasing hostility from the group. Dr. Chun accused me of being paralyzed by paranoia and unwilling to take risks that could help other survivors. Lieutenant Burke questioned whether my analysis was based on solid intelligence or personal fear. Even Marcus Thompson began to doubt whether my assessment of the situation was accurate. The psychological pressure was enormous. I was sitting on information that could potentially save lives and expose one of the greatest crimes in human history. But every instinct I had developed through 8 years of intelligence work told me that transmitting that information would be suicide. The people we were fighting had anticipated this exact scenario and had prepared countermeasures specifically designed to eliminate survivors like us. Tom Brennan's mental state continued to deteriorate throughout the morning. He had become fixated on the personnel files from Project Silent Storm, memorizing names and developing elaborate plans for tracking down and killing the people responsible for the attack. His desire for revenge was consuming him, and he was becoming increasingly agitated about what he saw as our inaction. The breaking point came when Tom discovered the facility's emergency armory and armed himself with weapons that Marcus Thompson had been trying to keep secured. Tom announced his intention to leave the facility and hunt down the conspirators, regardless of the consequences. His psychological break was complete, and he was no longer capable of rational decision-making. Dr. Chun and Lieutenant Burke tried to reason with him, but Tom was beyond reach. He believed that dying in an attempt to kill the conspirators was preferable to hiding in the facility while they continued to eliminate other survivors. His rage had given him a sense of purpose that was more appealing than the uncertainty and fear that defined our current situation. The situation became critical when Tom threatened to use the facility's communication array to broadcast the conspiracy information, regardless of our group's decision. He didn't care about the tactical implications or the risk to our survival. He just wanted to ensure that the truth was revealed before he died. His breakdown was forcing us into exactly the situation I had been trying to avoid. Sarah Martinez supported Tom's position, arguing that the moral imperative to warn other survivors outweighed the risks to our own safety. She had calculated that the information we possessed could potentially save hundreds or thousands of lives, even if transmitting it cost us our own. Her analysis suggested that the coded transmissions she had identified as a transmission window were genuine, not a trap. Lieutenant Burke was torn between her military training, which emphasized operational security, and her sense of duty to protect other American citizens. The evidence we had about the conspiracy represented intelligence that could be crucial for any organized resistance efforts, but sharing it would violate every protocol she had learned about protecting sources and methods. Marcus Thompson remained focused on immediate survival, but he was beginning to question whether survival was possible regardless of what we decided to do. The automated systems in the facility were providing our enemies with real-time intelligence about our activities, and the infected siege was becoming more sophisticated with each passing hour. We might be doomed whether we transmitted the information or not. The debate reached a crescendo when Dr. Chun discovered additional evidence that supported Sarah Martinez's analysis of the transmission window. The coded signals that had been coordinating infected attacks had indeed shown a gap in their normal patterns, suggesting that our enemies might be experiencing some kind of technical difficulty or operational challenge that could be exploited. But I had been analyzing the same data from a different perspective, and what appeared to be a transmission window looked to me like a deliberate pause designed to encourage exactly the kind of response we were contemplating. The people controlling the infected were sophisticated enough to create false opportunities that would trick survivor groups into revealing themselves. The psychological warfare aspects of our situation were becoming as dangerous as the physical threats we faced. Our enemies understood that survivor groups would eventually discover evidence of the conspiracy, and they had prepared methods to manipulate our response to that discovery. The apparent transmission opportunity was precisely the kind of trap that would appeal to people in our situation. My attempts to explain this analysis were increasingly dismissed as paranoia or cowardice. The other survivors were desperate for some kind of action that could give meaning to our situation, and the opportunity to expose the conspiracy represented hope in a hopeless situation. The psychological appeal of striking back against our enemies was overwhelming their ability to assess the tactical risks rationally. The final debate took place in the facility's main conference room, with all 17 survivors participating in what would be our last group decision. The proposal was to transmit comprehensive information about Project Silent Storm, the conspiracy behind the attack, and the evidence we had gathered about the people responsible. The transmission would be sent to multiple recipients, including international organizations, media outlets, and other government facilities that might still be operational. Tom Brennan had calmed down enough to participate in the discussion, but his position remained unchanged. He wanted the information transmitted, regardless of the consequences, and he was prepared to do it himself if the group didn't approve the action. His psychological state made him unpredictable and dangerous to our operational security. Dr. Chen argued passionately for the transmission, emphasizing our moral obligation to warn other survivors and expose the conspiracy. She had calculated that the information could potentially prevent other survivor groups from being eliminated and might eventually lead to justice for the people responsible for destroying civilization. Lieutenant Burke presented the military perspective, acknowledging the risks while emphasizing the potential strategic value of the intelligence we possessed. She argued that organized resistance would be impossible without information about the true nature of the threat we were facing, and that our duty to other Americans required us to share what we had learned. Sarah Martinez provided the technical analysis, explaining her assessment that the transmission window was genuine and that we had the capability to send the information before our enemies could respond. She had identified multiple communication pathways that could be used simultaneously to ensure that at least some of the information would reach its intended recipients. Marcus Thompson remained skeptical, but acknowledged that our situation was deteriorating regardless of what we decided. The facility's defenses were failing, the automated systems were continuing to provide intelligence to our enemies, and our resources were nearly exhausted. We might be facing elimination whether we transmitted the information or not. When it came time to vote, I found myself isolated in my opposition to the transmission. 16 of my fellow survivors supported the proposal, with only my vote opposing it. The democratic process had reached a conclusion that I believed would be fatal for everyone involved, but I was powerless to prevent it. The psychological pressure of being outvoted was enormous. These were intelligent, experienced people who had considered the risks and benefits of the action we were contemplating. My opposition was based on analysis that could be wrong, instincts that could be flawed, and intelligence assessments that were necessarily incomplete given our circumstances. But I also knew things about signals intelligence and enemy capabilities that the others didn't fully understand. The people we were fighting had resources and methods that went far beyond what most government personnel had been exposed to. They had been planning this operation for years, and they had anticipated scenarios like the one we were facing. The preparation for the transmission began immediately after the vote. Sarah Martinez and Dr. Chun worked together to compile the information into a comprehensive package that could be transmitted quickly through multiple communication pathways. Lieutenant Burke prepared backup plans in case the primary transmission methods failed. Marcus Thompson focused on security measures that might buy us additional time if the transmission triggered an immediate response. I spent the preparation time analyzing the enemy's likely response patterns and developing contingency plans for the survival scenarios that might emerge from our action. Even though I opposed the transmission, I was committed to helping my fellow survivors survive the consequences of their decision if possible. The most detailed preparation involved creating multiple copies of the information and establishing redundant transmission methods. If our enemies managed to stop the primary transmission, backup systems would automatically activate to ensure that at least some of the information reached its intended recipients. The technical sophistication of our approach was impressive, but I feared it would be inadequate against opponents who had been planning for this exact scenario. Tom Brennan had become focused on the operational aspects of the transmission, and his mental state had stabilized somewhat now that the group had committed to action. But his desire for revenge remained intense, and he was using the preparation time to memorize details about the conspirators that could be useful if he survived long enough to track them down. As evening approached on day 5, the final preparations were completed. The transmission was scheduled for 2:30 in the morning, during what Sarah Martinez had identified as the optimal window for avoiding detection by the automated monitoring systems. The timing would also minimize the likelihood of immediate retaliation, giving us several hours to implement defensive measures before our enemies could coordinate a response. But I knew from my analysis of the coded transmissions that our enemies were monitoring our activities in real time and were already preparing for our expected response. The apparent transmission window was a trap, and we were walking into it with our eyes open because the psychological pressure of inaction had become unbearable. The hours leading up to the transmission were filled with a strange mixture of hope and dread. The other survivors were energized by the prospect of finally taking action against the people who had destroyed their world. But I was haunted by the certainty that we were making a fatal mistake that would accomplish nothing except our own elimination. At 2:30 in the morning on day 6, Sarah Martinez activated the transmission systems and began broadcasting comprehensive information about Project Silent Storm and the conspiracy behind the zombie apocalypse to recipients around the world. The signal went out clearly and strongly, carrying detailed evidence that could expose one of the greatest crimes in human history. The response was immediate and devastating. Within minutes of the transmission beginning, coded signals began broadcasting from multiple sources, coordinating a massive infected assault on our facility from every direction simultaneously. The trap had been sprung, and we were about to pay the ultimate price for our decision to fight back against enemies who had anticipated our every move. As I sat alone in that server room, surrounded by evidence of the greatest conspiracy in human history, I had to make a choice that would determine whether the truth would die with us or survive to expose the people who had destroyed civilization. The dawn of Day 7 found me completely alone in the NSA facility, surrounded by the bodies of 16 people who had trusted me to keep them safe and whom I had failed to protect. The infected assault that followed our transmission had been swift, coordinated, and absolutely devastating. Within 3 hours of Sarah Martinez activating our communication systems, every other survivor in our group was dead. The attack had unfolded exactly as I had predicted, but knowing I was right provided no comfort as I watched my colleagues die through the security camera feeds. The coded signals that coordinated the assault had directed hundreds of infected to our location with precision that demonstrated the sophisticated nature of our enemy's capabilities. They hadn't just tracked our transmission. They had used it to orchestrate our destruction with surgical efficiency. Sarah Martinez had been the first to die, killed while still at the communication console, trying to complete the data transmission. The infected had broken through our primary defenses within 30 minutes of the broadcast beginning, moving with coordination that proved they were receiving real-time tactical guidance from external sources. Her sacrifice had ensured that most of our information about Project Silent Storm reached its intended recipients. But the cost had been everything. Dr. Chun had died trying to reach the emergency medical supplies to help wounded members of our group. Lieutenant Burke had fallen while attempting to establish a defensive perimeter in the main corridor. Marcus Thompson had been killed while trying to seal blast doors that might have bought us additional time. Tom Brennan had died fighting, using weapons from the emergency armory to kill dozens of infected before being overwhelmed. Each death had been captured in excruciating detail by the security cameras, and I had been forced to watch every moment while trapped in the server room by infected who were systematically searching the facility for any remaining survivors. The automated systems that had betrayed our location were now helping the infected conduct a methodical sweep to ensure that no one escaped alive. But my survival hadn't been accidental. The server room where I had taken shelter was equipped with independent power systems, advanced electromagnetic shielding, and communication equipment that was isolated from the facility's main networks. The same security features that protected sensitive classified information also protected me from the control signals that directed the infected. More importantly, the server room contained backup copies of all the intelligence I had gathered about the conspiracy, including classified files that hadn't been included in our transmission. The people responsible for this attack had eliminated the other survivors, but they hadn't succeeded in destroying the evidence that could expose them. During those first hours alone, I used the isolation to conduct a comprehensive analysis of everything that had happened since the initial attack. The patterns of enemy coordination, the timing of their responses, the sophisticated nature of their planning, all pointed to a conspiracy that was far more extensive than even I had initially realized. The coded transmissions that had coordinated the infected assault included references to operational schedules that confirmed my worst fears about Phase 3. The elimination of our survivor group wasn't just revenge for exposing Project Silent Storm. It was part of a systematic program to neutralize all potential resistance before implementing the final stage of their plan. Phase 3 was designed to establish permanent control over the remaining human population using refined versions of the electromagnetic manipulation technology that had created the infected. Instead of turning people into mindless monsters, the modified control signals would induce specific behavioral patterns that would make the survivors compliant, passive, and completely dependent on the authority figures who controlled the technology. The scope of this final phase was staggering. The conspirators had developed the capability to control human behavior on a mass scale, and they were preparing to use it to create a new form of civilization where individual freedom, critical thinking, and independent action would be impossible. The survivors of the zombie apocalypse would become willing slaves to the people who had orchestrated their suffering. But the most terrifying aspect of Phase 3 was its timeline. The coded transmissions indicated that implementation was scheduled to begin within 72 hours, using control signals that would be broadcast through the same communication networks that had created the infected. The window for preventing this final catastrophe was rapidly closing. My analysis of the enemy's capabilities revealed that they had been monitoring our activities from the beginning, not just through the facility's automated systems, but through sophisticated surveillance methods that had given them complete intelligence about our group's composition, resources, and decision-making processes. They had known exactly how we would respond to discovering the truth about the conspiracy. The transmission that had cost my colleagues their lives had been anticipated and prepared for. Our enemies had wanted us to broadcast information about Project Silent Storm because it would allow them to identify and eliminate other survivor groups who possessed similar intelligence or capabilities. Our attempt to warn other survivors had actually provided our enemies with targeting information for their systematic elimination program. The cruel irony was devastating. The people we had tried to help by exposing the conspiracy were now at greater risk because our transmission had revealed their locations and capabilities to the enemy. The moral courage that had motivated our decision had been turned against the very people we were trying to protect. But there was one aspect of our situation that our enemies hadn't fully anticipated. The information we had transmitted included technical details about the electromagnetic control systems that could potentially be used to develop countermeasures. If any of the recipients had the scientific expertise and resources to analyze what we had sent them, they might be able to protect themselves from Phase 3 implementation. The key vulnerability in the enemy's control systems was their dependence on specific electromagnetic frequencies that could be disrupted or blocked. Using relatively simple technology, noise-canceling equipment, electromagnetic shielding, and certain types of radio jamming could potentially protect people from the behavioral modification signals. I spent hours analyzing the technical specifications we had transmitted, identifying the most practical countermeasures that survivor groups could implement with limited resources. The information was useless to me in my current situation, but it could be invaluable to other survivors if I could find a way to get it to them without triggering another coordinated assault. The challenge was that any transmission from my location would immediately reveal my survival to the enemy and bring another wave of infected to eliminate me. But staying hidden while Phase 3 was implemented would mean watching the last hope for human freedom disappear without making any effort to prevent it. As the day progressed, I monitored the coded transmissions to track the enemy's preparation for Phase 3 implementation. The sophistication of their coordination was impressive and terrifying. Control signal generators were being activated at dozens of locations across the country. Backup systems were being tested to ensure redundancy, and infected populations were being repositioned to provide security for the critical infrastructure. The conspirators weren't just implementing a plan, they were executing a military operation with precision that demonstrated years of preparation and enormous resources. The scope of their coordination suggested that the conspiracy included far more people than the 50 individuals who had been directly involved in Project silent storm development. I also detected references to international coordination that indicated the conspiracy extended beyond American borders. Similar operations were apparently being implemented in other countries, suggesting that this wasn't just an attack on American civilization, but part of a global effort to reshape human society according to the specifications of a relatively small group of people with access to advanced technology. The psychological impact of understanding the true scope of what we were facing was almost overwhelming. This wasn't just a zombie apocalypse or even a domestic conspiracy. It was a coordinated assault on human freedom by people who had developed the technological capability to control human behavior on a species-wide scale. But the knowledge also clarified my responsibilities. I was potentially the only person with comprehensive intelligence about the conspiracy who was still in a position to take action against it. The transmission that had cost my colleagues their lives had distributed important information, but it hadn't included the most sensitive details about enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities that could be crucial for developing effective resistance. The decision I faced was simple in its implications, but agonizing in its personal cost. I could remain hidden in the server room and hope to survive Phase 3 implementation, potentially living to see the end of human freedom but preserving my own life. Or I could risk everything in an attempt to provide other survivors with information that might allow them to resist the final stage of the enemy's plan. The choice was complicated by the fact that any action I took would probably result in my death, while providing only a small chance of meaningfully helping other survivors. The enemy had demonstrated their capability to track and eliminate resistance efforts with ruthless efficiency. My sacrifice might accomplish nothing except adding my name to the list of people who had died fighting this conspiracy. But I also realized that my survival was meaningful only if it served some purpose beyond simple self-preservation. The knowledge I possessed was valuable only if it could be used to help other people resist the conspiracy that had destroyed civilization. Staying alive while Phase 3 eliminated the last hope for human freedom would be a form of moral suicide that would make my physical survival meaningless. The technical challenge was developing a method to transmit critical information without revealing my location or triggering another coordinated assault. The enemy's surveillance capabilities were sophisticated, but they weren't perfect. The fundu, same electromagnetic shielding that was protecting me from control signals, might also provide some protection from their tracking systems. I spent hours developing a transmission plan that would use the facility's backup communication systems to send information through multiple pathways simultaneously, creating confusion about the actual source of the signals. The plan involved activating automated transmission sequences that would continue broadcasting even after I left the facility, making it difficult for the enemy to determine whether the signals were coming from a live source or automated systems. The information package I prepared included everything I knew about the conspiracy, the technical specifications for developing countermeasures to the control systems, and detailed intelligence about Phase 3 implementation timelines and methods. Most importantly, it included specific warnings about how the enemy was using survivor transmissions to track and eliminate resistance groups. But the most critical element of my final transmission would be instructions for how other survivors could verify the information I was providing and take steps to protect themselves from both infected attacks and electromagnetic manipulation. The technical countermeasures were relatively simple to implement, but only if people understood the true nature of the threat they were facing. As evening approached on day 7, I made final preparations for what would probably be my last action as a free human being. The transmission was scheduled for midnight, using multiple communication pathways to ensure that the information would reach its intended recipients, even if some of the systems were compromised or destroyed. The psychological preparation was as important as the technical preparation. I was essentially committing suicide to provide other people with information that might not be useful to them and might actually make their situations worse by drawing enemy attention. The moral calculus was impossible to resolve definitively, but the alternative was accepting the end of human freedom without making any effort to prevent it. I also prepared detailed documentation of everything that had happened at our facility, including video evidence of the infected assaults and analysis of the enemy's coordination methods. If any part of the government survived this catastrophe, the information could be useful for understanding how the conspiracy had operated and developing countermeasures for any future attempts to use similar technology. The final hours before the transmission were spent monitoring enemy communications to identify the optimal timing for minimizing their ability to respond quickly. The coded signal showed patterns that suggested their attention was focused on Phase 3 preparation rather than surveillance for additional survivor groups. The timing would never be perfect, but midnight offered the best chance for the transmission to complete before triggering the coordinated response. At exactly midnight on what was now day 8 of the zombie apocalypse, I activated the transmission systems and began broadcasting comprehensive information about Project Silent Storm, the conspiracy behind the attack, and the countermeasures that could protect survivors from Phase 3 implementation. The signal went out clearly through multiple communication pathways, carrying humanity's last hope for resisting the final stage of the enemy's plan. The response was immediate and predictable. Within minutes, coded signals began coordinating infected movements toward the facility from multiple directions, but this time I was prepared. The automated transmission systems would continue broadcasting even after the facility was overrun, and I had prepared escape routes that would take me away from the building before the infected assault reached its peak intensity. The underground maintenance tunnels that Marcus Thompson had mapped during our time in the facility provided access to the surface through locations that were far enough from the building to avoid immediate detection. The same electromagnetic shielding that had protected the server room had been extended through sections of the tunnel system, providing some protection from the control signals that coordinated infected activities. My escape plan was based on reaching a specific government facility approximately 12 miles from our current location, where I could upload additional evidence and potentially establish contact with any surviving government operations. The facility had been designed to survive nuclear attacks and should have communication equipment that could reach international recipients who might be able to use the information I was providing. But more importantly, the escape attempt would serve as a test of whether the countermeasures I had developed could actually protect someone from the electromagnetic control systems. If I could successfully avoid detection and control while moving through infected territory, it would prove that resistance to the enemy's technology was possible. As I prepared to leave the facility that had been my shelter for the past week, I realized that regardless of whether I survived the next few hours, the information I had transmitted represented humanity's best chance for understanding and resisting the conspiracy that had destroyed civilization. The truth was now available to anyone with the knowledge and resources to use it effectively. The infected assault on the facility was beginning as I entered the tunnel system, but the automated transmission continued broadcasting, spreading information about Project Silent Storm and the countermeasures that could protect survivors from Phase 3 implementation. Whether anyone would receive and act on that information remained to be seen, but the truth was no longer limited to a single person hiding in a government facility. If you're hearing this recording, then either I made it to the upload facility and successfully transmitted this information to international recipients, or someone found my body and the evidence I was carrying and decided to continue the mission I started. Either way, the truth about what happened to our world is now in your hands. The people responsible for this apocalypse are still out there, still implementing their plan to control the surviving human population through electromagnetic manipulation. They have the technology to turn you into a willing slave, but they also have vulnerabilities that can be exploited if you understand how their systems work and take appropriate countermeasures. Most importantly, remember that any official rescue operations or government communications you encounter should be treated as potentially hostile until you can verify their authenticity. The conspiracy includes people at the highest levels of government, and they are using official channels to identify and eliminate resistance groups. The electromagnetic countermeasures I've described are your best protection against their control systems, but only if you implement them before phase 3 signals begin broadcasting in your area. The window for resistance is closing rapidly, but it hasn't closed completely. Human freedom can still be preserved if enough people understand the truth and take action to protect themselves and others. Stay vigilant, trust carefully, and remember that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who claim to be trying to help you.